The arena goes completely silent, not the kind of silence that happens between plays. The kind of silence that happens when 18,000 people simultaneously stop breathing because they cannot process what they just watched. 79 feet. That number gets thrown around a lot when people talk about this moment, but it doesn't fully register until you actually stand on a basketball court and look at how far that distance really is. It's not a deep three. It's not a half-court heave. It's practically a different sport entirely. Caitlin Clark catches the ball near half-court with the clock bleeding out. No hesitation, no panic, no searching for a better option. She sizes up the defense one final time, loads up, and releases a shot that has absolutely no business going in. The ball travels through the air with perfect rotation, hangs for what feels like an eternity, and then drops clean through the net like she'd been making that exact shot her entire life. The crowd doesn't erupt immediately. There's a half-second delay where everyone's brain tries to catch up to what their eyes just witnessed, and then the place absolutely loses its mind. Within hours, so does the rest of the world. But here's what nobody was asking in that moment: how did we get here? Within minutes of that shot dropping through the net, the clip was already moving across the internet at a speed that most viral moments never reach. Social media platforms were flooded simultaneously. Basketball analysts were pulling up the footage and running it back frame by frame, trying to make sense of the mechanics behind what they'd just seen. Former NBA players, guys who had spent their entire careers mastering the art of shooting a basketball, were posting reactions that ranged from pure disbelief to outright reverence. International basketball communities that don't typically pay close attention to women's basketball were sharing the clip with their own audiences. The moment had broken through every boundary that usually contains sports highlights to their specific audiences. What made the reaction so extraordinary wasn't just the distance, though 79 feet is genuinely staggering when you think about it. A standard NBA three-pointer sits at roughly 23 feet. A half-court shot is around 47 feet. What Clark hit was significantly beyond even that, but the distance alone doesn't explain why the internet collectively lost its composure. The reaction was so intense because of what the shot represented in a larger context. This wasn't a desperate heave. This wasn't someone flinging the ball toward the basket with zero expectation of it going in. Watch the footage carefully, and you'll see something that makes the whole thing even more remarkable. There is no panic in her body language, none whatsoever. The clock is running down, defenders are closing in. The pressure of the moment would make most professional athletes tense up and look for any reasonable option. Clark does something completely different. She takes a breath, reads the floor one final time, and launches that shot with the same calm confidence you'd expect from a player taking a wide-open mid-range jumper in a meaningless practice session. That confidence is what the internet actually responded to, even if most people couldn't articulate it in the moment. They weren't just watching a lucky shot. They were watching someone operate on a completely different psychological frequency than everyone else on the court. The numbers that followed the clip were staggering. Millions of views accumulated within hours, not days. Caitlin Clark's name trended worldwide across multiple platforms simultaneously. Sports broadcasters who hadn't been paying close attention to the WNBA season suddenly had no choice but to dedicate airtime to what had just happened. Casual basketball fans who couldn't name 5 WNBA players were suddenly searching her name and watching full game footage. The moment functioned as an introduction to an enormous new audience, and it was the most compelling possible introduction anyone could have scripted. What's particularly interesting is how quickly the conversation shifted from the shot itself to the broader questions it raised. Basketball coaches started pulling up her game tape. Defensive coordinators who had already been struggling to contain her started having urgent conversations about whether any of their existing strategies could realistically work against someone whose effective shooting range had apparently expanded to include the entire basketball court. Other players, both in the WNBA and across the broader basketball world, were watching and recognizing that something genuinely new was happening in front of them. The traditional three-point line, which had stood as the gold standard of long-range shooting for decades, suddenly felt like an arbitrary boundary that simply didn't apply to Clark. The line that was supposed to represent the outer limit of reasonable shooting range had become, in the context of watching her play, almost quaint. If she could make a shot from 79 feet with that level of composure, then what exactly was the three-point line supposed to mean when she was involved? There's also a psychological dimension to what that shot did to opposing teams that's worth understanding. When you're preparing a defensive game plan and you have to genuinely account for the possibility that a player might shoot from anywhere on the court, it fundamentally changes everything about how you approach that preparation. You can't use your defensive energy the way you normally would. You can't position your players the way conventional basketball wisdom would suggest. You're essentially being forced to defend the entire floor at once, which is an impossible task. The clip also sparked a wave of deeper analysis that went beyond simple reaction content. People started going back through her college footage, her early professional games, her training videos, looking for the thread that connected all of it to this singular moment. And what they found was a player who had been building toward exactly this kind of impact for years. The 79-footer wasn't an accident. It wasn't a bolt from the blue that nobody could have predicted. In retrospect, it was almost inevitable. Because when you track the arc of how Clark developed as a player and how deliberately she expanded her game, the real surprise isn't that she made that shot. The real surprise is that anyone was still surprised by it at all. But to truly understand why that moment landed the way it did, you have to understand where she came from. And that story is far more complicated than most people realize. When the Indiana Fever selected Caitlin Clark with the first overall pick, the reaction was loud and enthusiastic. Fans were excited. Media coverage was extensive. The anticipation surrounding her arrival felt like something the WNBA hadn't experienced in years. But underneath all of that excitement, if you listened carefully to the people who actually work in professional basketball, there was a quieter and far more cautious conversation happening simultaneously. Women's basketball had seen highly touted rookies before. The league had welcomed talented young players who arrived with massive reputations built on dominant college careers. Some of them delivered. Others discovered that the jump from college to professional basketball was significantly more brutal than their college success had suggested it would be. The professional game operates at a completely different level of intensity, athleticism, and defensive sophistication. Players who looked unstoppable in college sometimes spent their first professional seasons looking very stoppable indeed. Clark arrived with perhaps the most extraordinary college resume in the history of women's basketball. She had broken scoring records that had stood for decades. She had carried Iowa to heights the program had never previously reached. She had done things on a college basketball court that made people genuinely question whether what they were watching was real. But professional scouts and analysts were asking the question that always gets asked about dominant college players making the jump. Would it translate? Reports suggest that even within basketball circles that should have been enthusiastically in her corner, there were genuine reservations about whether her particular style of play would survive contact with professional-level defense. Her shooting range, the very thing that made her so spectacular to watch in college, was seen by some analysts as potentially vulnerable. The thinking went something like this: professional defenders are bigger, faster, and more disciplined than college defenders. They close out on shooters more aggressively. They contest shots more effectively. They don't give shooters the same kind of space and time that college defenses sometimes allow. The specific concern about her deep shooting range was that professional defenders would simply not allow her to operate from those distances. They would crowd her, push her off her spots, and force her to shoot from areas of the court where she'd be competing on more even terms with the rest of the league. Skeptics pointed to other players who had entered the league as high-volume shooters from deep range and found that professional defensive intensity essentially neutralized what had been their most dangerous weapon. There was also a broader structural skepticism that had nothing to do with her individual abilities. The assumption embedded in a lot of the cautious analysis was that the WNBA would humble her the way it had humbled so many talented young players before her. That she'd need time. That she'd need to adjust her game. That the records and the highlights and the impossible shots from college would need to be set aside while she went through the process of figuring out how to function at the professional level. Most analysts were generous enough to suggest this would take 1 or 2 seasons. Some suggested it might take longer. Then she played her first professional game, and then her second. And by the time a full quarter of basketball had passed in her professional debut, it was already becoming clear that the doubts had fundamentally misread what kind of player she actually was. Clark didn't need an adjustment period. She didn't arrive at the professional level and spend weeks finding her footing. She walked onto the professional court with complete confidence from the very first possession, and immediately began showing that everything she had done in college was built on genuine elite-level skill, not on competition that couldn't challenge her. What happened in those early professional games was remarkable to watch in real time. Defenders would give her space, trying to take away driving lanes and force her into outside shots. She'd immediately pull up from distances that made the crowd audibly react. Defenders would adjust and press up on her more aggressively to contest those deep shots. She'd blow past them and attack the basket with the kind of explosiveness that professional defenders aren't supposed to be beaten by so easily. Every defensive adjustment created a new problem. There was no configuration that worked. The narrative shifted incredibly quickly. Within weeks of her professional debut, the conversation had completely changed direction. Nobody was talking about adjustment periods anymore. Nobody was speculating about whether her college success would translate. The question that replaced all of those doubts was simultaneously more exciting and more unsettling for the rest of the league. If this is what she looks like before she's fully settled into the professional game, before she's had time to study opponents and develop chemistry with teammates and understand all the nuances of the professional system, then what exactly does her ceiling look like? Comparisons to legendary players started emerging almost immediately. Steph Curry's name came up constantly. Larry Bird got mentioned. People were reaching back through basketball history trying to find the right reference point for what they were watching. And while those comparisons might have seemed excessive or premature when applied to a rookie, they became harder and harder to dismiss the more she played. Because what she was doing on a professional basketball court was something that genuinely hadn't been seen before in women's basketball. The doubters hadn't disappeared, but they had gone very, very quiet. Basketball has a geometry to it that most casual fans don't fully appreciate. The sport isn't just about athleticism and skill in isolation. It's about spatial relationships, about where players are positioned relative to each other and relative to the basket, about how offensive and defensive schemes create and eliminate scoring opportunities based on those positions. The three-point line exists within this geometry as a specific boundary designed to create a particular kind of balance. Shoot from inside it and you score 2 points. Shoot from outside it and you score 3. The risk-reward calculation built into that boundary has shaped how the game is played for decades. Caitlin Clark doesn't operate within that geometry the way everyone else does. Her effective shooting range doesn't stop at the three-point line, which already sits at a distance that most players find challenging. It extends well beyond it, 5 feet beyond the line, 10 feet, 15 feet, and she's not making these shots occasionally in moments of desperation when nothing else is available. She's making them with enough consistency that opposing coaches have to account for them in their defensive preparation. That single fact changes the entire geometry of basketball when she's on the court. Think about what that means from a defensive standpoint. Traditional defensive schemes are built on a set of assumptions about where players are likely to shoot from and what distances are realistically dangerous. Zone defenses, for example, are designed to protect certain areas of the court based on those assumptions. They clog passing lanes, they make driving to the basket difficult, and they force offensive players to beat them from the perimeter. But those perimeter distances are calculated based on what normal shooting ranges look like. When a player's comfortable shooting range extends to half court and beyond, zone defenses lose their structural logic entirely. The zones can't cover distances they were never designed to cover. Pick and roll defense faces a similar problem. When Clark is involved in a pick and roll, the defending team can't use their standard coverage because the spacing requirements are completely different. The player guarding her can't go under screens the way defenders sometimes do against shooters they're trying to push off the three-point line, because that strategy assumes the three-point line is the relevant boundary. Against Clark, the relevant boundary is somewhere around midcourt, which changes the entire defensive calculation. Help side defense becomes almost impossible to deploy effectively for the same reason. If you leave her open to provide help elsewhere, you're potentially leaving her open from a distance where she can absolutely put the ball in the basket. Game footage makes this defensive crisis visible in a way that statistics alone can't fully capture. You can watch defenders picking her up full court, applying pressure from the moment she crosses half court, trying to prevent her from getting into her shooting motion from those extreme distances. It doesn't work. She has the ball handling ability and the athleticism to create separation even against that level of pressure, and once she creates even a sliver of space, she launches with complete confidence. You can watch defensive coordinators burning timeouts, making adjustments, trying different personnel combinations. Nothing produces a reliable answer. The comparisons to Steph Curry that emerged early in her professional career are understandable, but they also miss something important about what makes her situation genuinely unique. Curry revolutionized basketball by demonstrating that consistent, high-percentage shooting from deep three-point range was achievable at the professional level. He pushed the boundaries of what shooting range could look like and forced the entire sport to adapt around his abilities. But even Curry operates within certain parameters. There are distances where even his shooting percentage drops to levels that defenses can accept as a reasonable trade-off. There are ranges where teams can give him space without feeling like they're conceding automatic points. Clark seems to have fewer of those thresholds. The distances at which her confidence remains fully intact extend to places that most players, including the greatest shooters in basketball history, would consider unreasonable. And it's not just the confidence that's remarkable. It's the mechanics. Watch the footage of her releasing a shot from 30 feet out and compare it to a shot she takes from 18 feet. The form is nearly identical. The release point is the same. The rotation on the ball is the same. Her body isn't straining to generate enough force to reach the basket from those distances. She's generating that power efficiently and consistently, which is what allows the accuracy to hold up even from ranges that seem physically unreasonable. Reports suggest this didn't happen by accident or purely through natural talent. The extreme range she's developed is reportedly the result of years of deliberate, specific practice. She reportedly spent enormous amounts of time working on shooting from distances that most coaches would actively discourage their players from attempting, because the conventional wisdom says those shots aren't worth practicing when you could be working on higher percentage opportunities. Clark apparently decided that conventional wisdom didn't apply to her situation and put in the repetitions to prove it. Thousands of shots from impossible distances, practiced until muscle memory made them feel natural. The result isn't just an individual skill. It's a strategic weapon that forces everyone around her, teammates and opponents alike, to approach the game differently. When she's on the floor, the entire court becomes a potential scoring zone. And that reality is something the sport is still in the process of fully adjusting to. There's a version of Caitlin Clark's career that could have existed where she arrived in the professional game as a pure shooter. Given the range she's developed, that alone would have made her one of the most dangerous offensive players in the league. Teams would have had to dedicate enormous defensive resources just to containing her shooting. She would have drawn crowds. She would have gone viral regularly. She would have had a perfectly successful career just doing that one thing at an extraordinarily high level. That's not the player she chose to be. And the gap between what she could have been and what she actually is represents one of the most underappreciated aspects of everything she's brought to professional basketball. Watch game footage of Clark running the offense, and the first thing that grabs your attention, after you've recovered from the shock of her shooting range, is how she reads the floor. She's constantly scanning. Her eyes are moving before the ball is even in her hands. She's identifying defensive positions, recognizing where help defenders are cheating toward her, spotting which of her teammates has gotten open as a result of the defensive attention she's drawing. She's processing all of this information in real time, under pressure, while simultaneously managing the ball and making decisions about her own movement. It's the kind of court awareness you'd expect from a point guard who had spent a decade at the professional level, not from someone in their first professional season. The no-look passes that have become something of a signature element of her game aren't performed for the sake of highlight reels. Understanding why she makes them the way she does requires understanding the defensive situation she's operating in. When defenders are so focused on her as a shooting threat that they're tracking her every movement and ignoring everything else on the court, she's able to see passing lanes that defenders have essentially created through their own overtension. The no-look pass isn't flashy for the sake of being flashy. It's the natural result of her eyes being fixed on the passing lane while her hands complete the shot fake or the dribble move that holds the defender in place. She's exploiting defensive attention and converting it directly into assist opportunities. One of the most striking sequences visible in game footage involves her driving hard into the paint with defenders collapsing around her. The conventional expectation in that situation is that a player will either attempt a contested finish at the rim or draw a foul. Clark does something different. As the defenders collapse toward her, she keeps her composure completely, locates the teammate who has become open as a direct result of that defensive collapse, and delivers a pass that arrives exactly where it needs to be. The precision of those passes in those moments is remarkable because she's making the decision to pass, identifying the target, and executing the delivery, all while moving at high speed with multiple defenders in close proximity. Her 13th assist of the season, a moment captured clearly in game footage, illustrates this perfectly. She draws the defense toward her completely, waits until the defensive commitment is total and irreversible, and then whips a cross-court pass to an open shooter in the corner who has been completely forgotten by a defense that was entirely focused on stopping Clark. The basketball IQ required to recognize that moment, to wait for exactly the right instant, and to deliver that pass with that accuracy under that kind of pressure is not something that can be easily taught or developed over a short period. What makes her playmaking particularly devastating is how it interacts with her scoring threat. The two elements aren't separate. They feed each other constantly. When defenses commit heavily to stopping her shot, passing lanes open. When defenses adjust to account for her passing, her shooting becomes even more dangerous because she's getting cleaner looks. She's essentially running a continuous feedback loop where every defensive decision that successfully addresses one threat makes another threat worse. There's no neutral position for a defense to settle into because every adjustment has immediate consequences. Reports from her teammates describe something interesting. The experience of playing alongside her apparently changes how you think about your own positioning and movement on the court. When you know that the player with the ball has the vision and the willingness to find you anywhere on the floor, you move differently. You cut harder. You hold your spots more confidently. You trust that if you get open, the ball will find you. That trust, reportedly, is something that develops quickly when playing with Clark, because she demonstrates so consistently that she's actually watching and actually delivering. The psychological dimension of this extends to opposing players as well. When you're defending a teammate of Clark's, you can't fully commit to helping stop Clark because you know that helping will get your assignment found with an assist. But if you don't help on Clark, she's potentially shooting from distances where the shot goes in with uncomfortable regularity. It's a genuine dilemma with no clean answer, which is exactly why she's so difficult to contain as a complete player. She could have been just a shooter. The league would have had to deal with that version of her. But the version that actually exists, the one with the shooting range and the court vision and the passing ability and the basketball IQ, that version is something the sport is still developing a response to. There's a version of every basketball player that shows up in practice and in comfortable games when the outcome is already decided and the pressure is minimal. And then there's what shows up when none of that is true. When the score is close and the clock is running down and every single possession feels like it carries the weight of the entire game. Those two versions of a player are sometimes completely different people, and the gap between them is often where reputations are ultimately made or destroyed. Caitlin Clark doesn't have that gap, or if she does, it runs in the opposite direction from what you'd expect. Watch her in the fourth quarter of a close game and then compare that footage to her performance in a blowout. The blowout version is excellent. Composed, skilled, making the right plays, but the close game version operates at a different frequency entirely. The movements are sharper, the decision-making is faster. The confidence radiates more visibly. She doesn't just hold her level when the stakes rise, she elevates. And that's a quality that separates the very good from the genuinely great in professional sports. Game footage from late in close games shows something that opposing coaches have apparently discussed at length. There's a moment when Clark gets the ball in a crucial situation where the defender can visibly see what's about to happen and still can't prevent it. The defender knows she might step back and launch from distance. They know she might drive. They know she might find an open teammate. But knowing all of that doesn't help them because she reads their response and attacks whatever choice they've made. In the highest pressure moments of professional basketball games, she's operating one full decision ahead of the people trying to stop her. Sports psychologists who study elite athletic performance talk about something called flow state. That zone where an athlete is so completely locked in that their performance seems to operate on a different level than normal. Most athletes access flow state inconsistently, and many find that the pressure of high-stakes moments actually works against their ability to get there. The anxiety of the moment creates interference that breaks the natural rhythm of performance. Clark appears to work differently. The pressure of high-stakes moments seems to function as a trigger for her rather than an obstacle. The bigger the moment, the more locked in she becomes. You can see it clearly in her body language. When the game is close and the fourth quarter is winding down, there's no tightness in her movements. Her shot preparation looks identical to what it looks like in the first quarter of a comfortable win. Her decision-making doesn't become more conservative or more hesitant. Her confidence in her own abilities doesn't waver based on the external circumstances. She has what coaches reportedly describe as a baseline confidence that doesn't fluctuate with momentum. Whether she just hit 3 consecutive shots or just missed 3 consecutive shots, she approaches the next possession with the same certainty. Teams have tried to exploit her competitive intensity in pressure situations. Clark has accumulated technical fouls at a rate that suggests her on-court fire occasionally spills over into confrontations with officials. Some of those technicals have come in important moments of games. And there's a legitimate tactical question worth considering. As her career continues, will opposing teams start deliberately trying to provoke situations that might draw technicals from her in crucial moments? Will they attempt to use her competitive nature as a strategic tool against her? These are the kinds of conversations that reportedly happen in coaching rooms when teams are preparing to face her. But here's what makes those technicals interesting from a different angle. They reveal something authentic about how she's wired. She doesn't back down from confrontation. She doesn't accept what she perceives as injustice without responding. She cares about winning at a level that occasionally overrides the strategic calculation of staying out of foul trouble. That same quality, that refusal to accept unfavorable situations quietly, is almost certainly part of what makes her so effective in pressure moments. She doesn't shrink, she responds. There's also something worth noting about how she manages the emotional volatility of professional basketball. The sport is a constant series of momentum swings. Teams go on runs, leads evaporate, situations that look decided become competitive again in the space of 2 or 3 possessions. Most players ride those swings emotionally, their confidence rising with positive momentum and dipping with negative momentum. Clark reportedly maintains an unusual stability through all of it. Her confidence doesn't spike when things are going well or crater when they're going poorly. It stays at the same consistent level, which means that when momentum swings back in her team's favor, she's already in the right mental state to take advantage of it. Reports from coaches who have had the opportunity to observe her closely suggest that this kind of psychological architecture is genuinely rare. Some athletes are built this way from the beginning. Others work their entire careers trying to develop it and never quite get there. At 22 years old, Clark already has it fully intact, which raises an obvious and somewhat uncomfortable question for the rest of the league. If she's already this composed, this effective, this cold-blooded in the biggest moments at this age, What does she look like in 5 years when she has a full career of experience behind her? The answer to that question is something opposing teams are probably trying not to think about too carefully. Every athlete who reaches the level of attention and scrutiny that Clark has reached eventually discovers that stardom comes with complications attached. The spotlight that makes you famous also illuminates everything, the brilliant moments and the difficult ones equally. Clark's rise has been extraordinary by any measure, but it hasn't been without elements that have made some observers pause and ask harder questions about what the full picture actually looks like. The technical fouls are the most visible of these complications. Game footage has captured Clark receiving her 5th technical foul of the season, a moment that generated significant commentary from broadcasters and analysts. Technical fouls at that rate suggest a pattern rather than isolated incidents, and the pattern tells a story about how her competitive intensity manifests in high-pressure situations. Some of the technicals have come from arguing officiating decisions. Others have reportedly stemmed from general on-court demeanor during heated moments in games. The immediate takeaway from most observers has been that she simply cares too much and competes too hard, which is a generous interpretation and probably an accurate one. But there's a more tactically interesting question lurking underneath the obvious explanation. In professional sports, opponents study everything. They study shooting tendencies, defensive habits, preferred moves in specific situations. They also study psychological patterns. If a player has demonstrated a consistent tendency to respond intensely to certain kinds of provocation, opposing teams will eventually design situations to exploit that tendency. The question of whether Clark's competitive fire could be systematically used against her in crucial moments is one that analysts are reportedly beginning to take seriously. Then there's the injury situation, which represents a different category of concern entirely, one that's more serious and more legitimately worrying than the technical foul pattern. Reports emerged during preseason of a right knee issue that required evaluation and a recovery period that was initially estimated at around 2 weeks. On its surface, a minor preseason knee issue sounds like exactly the kind of thing that gets managed and forgot. Athletes deal with minor injuries constantly. The human body, subjected to the demands of professional sports training and competition, accumulates small problems regularly. But the concern that the basketball community is reportedly paying attention to isn't about this specific injury in isolation. It's about what this injury, combined with her playing style, suggests about the long-term durability question. Clark plays in a way that is extraordinarily physically demanding. She's constantly driving hard into the paint and absorbing contact from defenders who are bigger and more physical than she is. She's making sudden directional changes at high speeds, the kind of lateral movements that generate significant stress on knee joints. She's exploding into jump shots from extreme distances repeatedly throughout games. She's moving at an intensity level that would be demanding for any professional athlete. Over the course of a single season, these demands are manageable. The human body is resilient and recovers effectively when given proper rest and treatment, but professional sports careers don't last one season. They last 10 years, 12 years, 15 years if an athlete is fortunate and careful. The wear and tear accumulation over that kind of time frame, subjected to the specific physical demands of Clark's playing style, is what reportedly has medical professionals and team officials having careful conversations about load management and long-term health planning. Rumors circulating in basketball circles suggest that her recovery from the knee issue was monitored with particular attention precisely because of these longer-term concerns. The injury itself may have been minor, but it functions as a data point. If her knees remain healthy through the next several seasons, then the concerns were probably overblown and her body is handling the demands of her playing style without significant issues. If another knee problem emerges next season, then a pattern is beginning to take shape that raises more serious questions. Right now, nobody knows which of those futures is coming. The story is still being written. There's a third dimension to the complications surrounding her rise that gets less attention than the technicals and the injuries, but might be the most psychologically complex of the three. Clark is 22 years old and living under a level of public scrutiny that most people never experience at any age. Every game she plays is filmed and analyzed. Every decision she makes on the court is immediately subject to expert commentary and public opinion. Every bad stretch, and every player has bad stretches, becomes a piece of content that millions of people discuss, debate, and sometimes weaponize. The pressure to maintain excellence under those conditions is constant and relentless. Some athletes thrive in that environment. They're energized by attention and find that public scrutiny sharpens their focus rather than disrupting it. Others find that the constant observation gradually wears them down in ways that aren't immediately visible. The mental and emotional toll of never being able to have a quiet, unobserved game, of knowing that every mistake will be replayed and analyzed, is real and significant. Whether Clark is in the first category or the second is something that only time will fully reveal. Reports suggest her team is acutely aware of all of these concerns and is working to manage them carefully. Long-term health and well-being are reportedly being prioritized over short-term performance demands. But the pressure to have her on the court is equally real, because when she's not there, the difference is immediately and obviously felt. Balancing those competing realities is the challenge that her team is navigating right now. And how they navigate it could have a significant impact on how the rest of her story gets written. Strip away all the individual elements, the shooting range, the playmaking, the clutch performances, and what you're left with is a question that defensive coaches across the league are reportedly wrestling with on a weekly basis. What exactly do you do about Caitlin Clark? Not in terms of any specific skill or tendency, but comprehensively. What is the defensive philosophy that successfully contains someone whose skill set covers this much of the game at this level of quality? The honest answer, based on everything the evidence suggests so far, is that nobody has found one. And the reason they haven't found one isn't because defensive coaches aren't smart or aren't working hard enough. It's because she's developed too many different ways to hurt a defense for any single approach, to address all of them simultaneously. Start with tempo. Clark's ability to control the pace of a game is something that might not generate highlight clips the way her deep threes do, but it's arguably one of the most important weapons in her arsenal. Games have rhythm, and whoever controls that rhythm has a significant advantage. When she wants to push pace and create transition opportunities before defenses can get set, she does it with precision. When the situation calls for slowing down, managing the clock, and executing a half-court offense that forces the defense to hold its position for an extended period, she does that with equal effectiveness. The ability to switch between those two modes seamlessly, to read what the game needs and adjust instantly, is the kind of thing that separates truly elite players from players who are merely excellent. Her adaptability to defensive schemes is equally comprehensive. Opposing teams have reportedly tried every realistic approach in their attempts to limit her effectiveness. Full court pressure designed to tire her out and disrupt her rhythm before she gets into her shooting range. Zone defenses intended to clog the three-point line and force her to beat them with other tools. Physical man-to-man defense designed to make every catch and every dribble as uncomfortable as possible. Switching schemes that attempt to always keep a specific type of defender on her regardless of where she moves. None of these approaches have produced reliable results, not because they're poorly designed, but because she has a convincing counter to each of them. Press her full court, and she uses her ball handling to create separation, then attacks the disorganized defense before it can recover. Play zone, and she either finds the gaps in the zone with her passing, shoots over it from distances the zone wasn't designed to cover, or drives into the soft spots that zones create. Physical man coverage creates contact situations that she draws fouls from or uses to create rhythm for pull-up jumpers. Switching schemes create mismatches she immediately identifies and attacks. There's essentially no configuration that eliminates her effectiveness across the board, because she simply mastered too many different ways to impact a basketball game. What's also striking is how her basketball IQ elevates all of her other abilities. Raw talent without understanding produces a player who can make spectacular plays in obvious situations. Basketball IQ is what allows a player to make the right play in situations that aren't obvious, to read subtle defensive cues, to understand how one decision on one possession sets up an advantage 2 or 3 possessions later. Clark operates at an unusually high level of this kind of strategic understanding. Every action she takes on the court seems connected to a larger picture of how she's trying to attack a particular defense over the course of a game. Watch how she uses hesitation moves and changes of speed to manipulate defenders. She's not just trying to get past her immediate defender on any given possession. She's conditioning defenders to expect certain things from her so that she can exploit those expectations later in the game. She'll attack the same way multiple times in a row, establishing a pattern, and then break the pattern at the moment it matters most. That's not instinct. That's the basketball equivalent of chess thinking, and it's being deployed at 22 years old. There's also the psychological dimension of what she does to the teams that face her, something that goes beyond the tactical. Reports from players who have competed against her describe an unusual experience, the sense that she's operating with complete certainty about what's going to happen before it happens. When she has the basketball, there's a perceptible energy shift that people on the court feel regardless of which team they're on. Her teammates have reportedly described feeling more confident and more capable when she's on the floor with them. Opposing players have described the difficulty of maintaining focus when they're always aware that something unexpected might be coming. The combination of all of these elements, the tempo control, the adaptability, the basketball IQ, the psychological presence, the ability to do almost everything at an elite level without obvious weaknesses, creates a player who is genuinely difficult to categorize using the existing vocabulary of basketball analysis. Most players have a primary identity. They're shooters, or playmakers, or defenders, or scorers. Clark operates across all of those categories simultaneously and at levels that would individually make her dangerous. The fact that she combines them all is what makes her something the sport hasn't fully developed a framework for yet. And she's 22 years old. The most unsettling thing about everything that's been documented so far is that it almost certainly isn't the finished product. /legacy is a word that gets overused in sports commentary. It gets attached to moments that feel significant in real time, but fade into the background as years pass and the context around them changes. What Caitlin Clark is building feels different from that. Not because of the shots she's making or the records she's breaking, though both of those things matter. It feels different because of the nature of the change she's producing in the sport around her, and what that change means for everyone who comes after her. Start with the numbers that are hardest to argue with. Viewership figures for games featuring Clark have consistently demonstrated that she draws audiences that women's basketball has not historically been able to reach. Her college games didn't just set viewership records within the context of women's college basketball. They set records that put them in conversation with men's college basketball audiences, territory that had previously seemed unreachable for the women's game. Her professional games have continued that trajectory. People who couldn't name the teams in the WNBA a year ago are now watching games specifically to see what she does next. That audience expansion matters enormously beyond the simple fact of viewership numbers. Broadcasting deals are built on audiences. Advertising revenue flows to content that people watch. Investment decisions by companies considering whether to sponsor teams or leagues or individual athletes are made based on demonstrated audience interest. Clark has provided that demonstrated interest in a way that creates concrete financial consequences for the sport. The investments in women's basketball broadcasting and infrastructure that have begun to materialize aren't charity or social goodwill. They're responses to genuine market signals that Clark's presence in the game has generated. The broader cultural significance of what she's doing extends well beyond box scores and broadcast rights. Women's sports exist within a larger conversation about whether female athletes deserve the same attention, investment, and respect as their male counterparts. That conversation has been ongoing for decades and has produced real progress, but also persistent resistance. Clark isn't engaging in that conversation through interviews or advocacy. She's engaging in it through performance, by being so undeniably spectacular that ignoring her becomes impossible and dismissing her becomes untenable. Every time she hits a shot from an absurd distance or delivers a pass that makes professional defenders look unprepared, she's making an argument that doesn't require words. The generational impact she's having on young players is something that will take years to fully measure, but is already visible in how the game is being played at youth and college levels. There's reportedly a cohort of young basketball players currently coming up who have grown up watching Clark and internalized what she's normalized. The idea that you should practice shooting from extreme distances. The expectation that a female basketball player can be the most exciting player on any floor she walks onto. The understanding that aggressive, high-intensity play is not just acceptable, but celebrated and rewarded at the highest levels of the sport. Those lessons, absorbed by thousands of young players right now, will produce a generation of women's basketball players who aspire to and reach levels that previous generations didn't have a roadmap for. The sponsorship and business ecosystem around her has grown into something that would have seemed improbable for a women's basketball player just a few years ago. Companies aren't investing in Clark out of obligation or because of pressure to support women's sports. They're investing because she's produced exactly the kind of genuine cultural resonance that makes athletes valuable marketing partners. She's compelling. She creates moments that people share and discuss. She's attracted an audience that extends well beyond the core women's basketball fanbase. That commercial success creates opportunities not just for her, but for every female athlete who comes after her, because it demonstrates that the market for women's sports exists at a scale that justifies serious investment. What's particularly interesting about how she's navigating all of this is what reports suggest about her own thinking. She apparently isn't approaching her career primarily as an opportunity for individual achievement, though the individual achievements have been extraordinary. Reports suggest she's thinking in terms of what her presence in the league can do for the sport itself, how it can increase investment, expand audiences, create infrastructure improvements, and open doors that have historically been closed to female athletes. She wants to win championships, which is the fundamental competitive goal. But she also reportedly wants her presence to mean something beyond the wins and losses. That combination of individual excellence and genuine investment in the bigger picture of what women's basketball can become is what makes her such a compelling figure at this particular moment in the sport's history. She arrived at exactly the right time, when women's basketball was ready for a transcendent player, but hadn't yet found one at this level. And she's delivering in a way that is simultaneously satisfying the immediate hunger for spectacular basketball and laying the groundwork for something much larger and more lasting. The 79-foot buzzer beater will be in highlight reels for as long as basketball is played. The no-look passes will be replayed in teaching moments for the next generation of players. The deep threes from impossible distances will be the subject of analytical discussions about how the game changed in this era. But perhaps the most enduring part of what she's building right now isn't any specific moment or any specific record. It's the version of women's basketball that exists on the other side of her career, bigger, better funded, more respected, and full of players who learned what was possible by watching her do it first. So here's where we land. A 79-foot shot that broke the internet, a rookie who silenced every doubt in about 1/4 of professional basketball, a shooting range that has forced the sport to question its own geometry, a playmaking ability that turns defensive attention into scoring opportunities for everyone around her, a psychological makeup that performs better under pressure than it does without it, controversies and injury concerns that add complexity without diminishing what's already been accomplished, and a legacy that's being written in real time, with most of the pages still blank. The question that gets asked most often about Caitlin Clark is whether she's living up to the hype. But that question already feels outdated. She didn't just live up to the hype. She made the hype look conservative. The more relevant question at this point is one that nobody can fully answer yet. What does the ceiling actually look like for someone who keeps raising it every time she steps on the court? She's 22. She's already changed the sport. She hasn't peaked yet. Whatever comes next, one thing is certain. The game of women's basketball will never look exactly the way it looked before she arrived. And that might be her greatest shot of all.